Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
A Conservative MP who was found to have broken lobbying rules won't be suspended for now after MPs narrowly voted to look at an overhaul of their disciplinary process. An investigation by the Parliamentary Standards Watchdog had ruled that former Minister Owen Paterson should be suspended for 6 weeks for repeatedly lobbying ministers and officials for 2 companies paying him more than £100,000 a year. But today's vote means his suspension is halted for now. Downing Street insists the move is about the fairness of the system, not one individual case. But Labour called it an absolute disgrace and accused the government of breaking and then remaking the rules. Here's our political correspondent, Ian Watson.
How much faith do you place in politicians to police themselves? Today, the government backed changes which could give MPs accused of wrongdoing a new right of appeal. Labour say this looks like the government's watering down the system that's supposed to tackle sleaze and could further widen the gulf between politicians and the public.
This isn't about playing politics in this place. This is about playing by the rules. Yeah! And as we can see, it's one rule for everybody else and one rule for the Tory Conservatives. When they break the rules, Mr. Speaker, they just remake the rules.
But Boris Johnson insisted the government simply wanted to give MPs the same rights as any other people accused of professional wrongdoing.
May I respectfully say to her that I believe that she needs to focus, instead of playing politics on this issue, which is what they are doing. I think that she needs to consider the procedures of this House in a spirit of fairness.
And this is what the row is all about. Labour accused the government of acting to help this man, the former Conservative Cabinet Minister Owen Paterson. An investigation by the independent parliamentary watchdog found that he'd broken rules on lobbying. A cross-party committee of MPs said, as a result, he should be suspended from the House of Commons for 30 days. But that action has now been put on hold while changes to the system are being considered. Owen Paterson has said that a 2-year stressful investigation was a contributory factor in his wife taking her own life. But he's also had other complaints about how the investigation was carried out, that he had no right of appeal, no ability to call witnesses in his own defence. So now, a committee of Conservative MPs are looking at making changes accordingly. Critics say this shows favouritism and will further undermine public confidence in Parliament.
I have not done any radio or television interviews on this matter because, as chair of the committee, I'm a servant of the House. I want to thank the Commissioner and the committee, and in particular I want to wish the member for Ayr, Carrick and Cumnock well, because I know he's very ill at the moment, and I hope that he'll be back with us soon. I think it's inappropriate to comment on absences from the committee when people don't understand why they might be absent. I am painfully conscious that the member for North Shropshire lost his wife in tragic circumstances in June 2020, and I wish to express my sincere condolences to him. I have known suicide in my own family, as he knows, and I've performed many funerals for suicides. I know the grief, the anguish, and often the guilt that is associated. This last year must have been very distressing for him, and the committee took these circumstances fully into account in considering his conduct. I want to address the charges, the processes, the sanction, and the amendment. The charges are very serious. The member repeatedly, over a sustained period, lobbied officials and ministers on behalf of his paying clients, Randox and LYNN'S Foods, from whom he was receiving more than £9,000 a month, as he still is. He pursued their commercial interests. When they could not get meetings with officials and ministers, he used his privileged position as a Member of Parliament to secure them. Providing privileged access is a valuable service. He promoted what he called Randox's superior technology. He wanted the government to use Randox's calibration system. He repeatedly used his taxpayer-funded parliamentary office for commercial meetings. This is paid lobbying. In some shape or form, it has been banned since 1695, and expressly so since Cash for Questions, which brought this House into terrible disrepute in the 1990s. One Conservative member described it to me as a catalogue of bad behaviour. I have yet to meet a Conservative MP who has not said to me he clearly broke the rules. I think that includes the Leader of the House. He says that he was raising serious wrongs, but he did not say so at the time. If these were truly serious, you might have expected him to write articles or do interviews in the media, as he was perfectly entitled to do. He did not. He did the one thing he was banned from doing: lobby ministers time and again in a way that conferred a direct benefit on his paying clients. That is expressly forbidden. It is a corrupt practice. On the process, he has had a fair hearing. We had legal advice from Speaker's Counsel throughout. As one former High Court judge said to me yesterday, the procedure is consistent with natural justice and similar or identical to workplaces up and down the country. We on the committee spent many hours reviewing the evidence in this case without fear or favour. He had prior notice of the charges and the evidence against him at every stage. He had his legal advisers with him. The committee invited him to make his appeal against the Commissioner's findings in writing and in person, and I hope he would confirm that we gave him every opportunity to make his case to us, and the session was conducted respectfully and fairly. I think he's nodding. He says his witnesses should have been interviewed. Natural justice requires that witnesses be heard, but that does not necessarily mean that they have to be heard orally or cross-examined. We did what many courts and tribunals do every day of the week.
Absolutely.
We reviewed all the witness statements, took them into consideration and published them in full. He claims that the Commissioner had made up her mind before she sent her memorandum. This is completely to misunderstand the process. As she has done in every other case, she started an investigation. She invited the member to meet with her and or to submit evidence. Once she had completed her investigation, and once she had, by definition, found on a preliminary basis that there had been a breach of the rules, she submitted a memorandum to the member for his comments, and then to us. This is when we heard his appeal, in writing and in person. The sanction. As we say in the report, each of Mr. Patterson's several instances of paid advocacy would merit a suspension of several days. But the fact that he has repeatedly failed to perceive his conflict of interest and used his privileged position as a Member of Parliament to secure benefits for two companies for whom he was a paid consultant is even more concerning. He has brought the House into disrepute. A Conservative colleague, whom I respect a great deal, said to me on Monday that justice should always be tempered by mercy. I agree. But justice also demands no special favours. These are the precedents that we considered. Patrick Mercer was suspended for 6 months. Ian Paisley, sorry, I've forgotten his constituency, for 30 days. Jonathan Said, 14 days. George Galloway, 18 days. When Geoffrey Robinson failed to provide proper responses to the Commissioner and Committee, he was suspended for a month. These are the precedents. This case is just as serious because it involved at least 14 instances. It was a pattern of behaviour, and the member has said time and again over the last week that he would do the same again tomorrow. So if the House were to vote down or water down the sanction or carry the amendment, it would be endorsing his action. We would be dismantling the rule on paid advocacy, which has been around in some shape or form since 1695. I'm afraid the public would think that we would be the Parliament that licensed cash for questions. Let me turn to the amendment. The Honourable Lady, Right Honourable Lady knows that I've worked with her on many things. I think she's very wrong today. It is the very definition of injustice that one should change the rules or the process at the very last moment, and to do so for a named individual, which is what the amendment does today. Retrospective legislation to favour or damage an individual because they are a friend or a foe is immoral, and the polar opposite of the rule of law. That is why, as the leader knows, I spoke and voted with Conservative members when we were considering a retrospective motion to subject the member for Delyn to a recall petition. The amendment today should fail on that basis alone. It is the opposite of due process. It purports to set up an appeal process, but an appellate body has to be independent. Every single member of this body will be party pre, by definition. They will have been whipped today and will have taken a view today. They will almost certainly have voted. By agreeing to his name being put forward, the chairman, or proposed chairman, is already not independent. I point out very gently to the right honourable member who moved the amendment that it was her motion as Leader of the House on the 7th of January 2019 that set up the Standards Committee in its present form. She said then that a greater element of independence was required and that having 7 lay members and 7 parliamentary members on the Standards Committee provides the right balance, having the memory and the corporate understanding of being in this place, while at the same time ensuring that we can benefit from the experience and knowledge of independent lay members. Yet the body she proposes today will have no independent members, no independence. I won't if she doesn't mind. She must know that this is a retrograde step. She also said then, and I would say this strongly to all honourable members who have said many things about the Parliamentary Commissioner, she said then, ensuring that the Commissioner can operate independently is vital and will better enable justice for those seeking recourse. I also think that this amendment will drive a coach and horses through our standards system. It will mean that we have 2 rival select committees on standards at the same time, charged with the same piece of business. As many members may know, the Standards Committee at the moment is engaged in a review of the Code of Conduct, as we're required to do in every Parliament, and that will include review of the operation of the system. I am absolutely certain that there are things that we could do better. I am determined to make sure that we will do things better to ensure natural justice. And I hope, I'm not going to give way to him if he doesn't mind. I do just want to conclude my remarks. I'm sorry, he has already caught Mr. Speaker's eye. We are close, as I said, to agreeing a report on how we can improve the system. But I would also say this process that's being suggested keeps this running for yet more months. I agree with the Leader of the House. I hate investigations that take a long time. I would very gently point out, however, and the Commissioner was right, I think, to suspend her investigation after the honourable member's wife's death. And it was only once his lawyers said that it was okay to start again that she initiated again. All the delays in the process have been down to the right honourable member seeking further extensions of deadlines, and we have always sought to meet those. I think it's inappropriate to keep this going any further. I would also draw a distinction between an appeal on the facts, which we have heard, and an appeal on the sanction. Now, it may be right that there should be an appeal process on the sanction. That isn't the process that we've adopted with any other member thus far, and that's why I think it's wrong to confuse today changing the process with the case in hand. It is, as I said earlier, by definition, wrong to change the process at the very last moment. We also say in our report, a member is entitled to contest, even vigorously contest, the Commissioner's interpretation of the rules and her findings. We do not mark down any member for doing so. The aggravating factor in this case was a lack of insight into a conflict of interest, not lack of acceptance of breach. And I would say this to the member. This could have been very different if you had come to us and said, I'm sorry, I was trying to do the right thing, but I got it wrong. I want the House to uphold the highest standards, and I accept the reprimand and the sanction. I hope my constituents will deal kindly with me. The danger is, if this amendment is carried today, his name will become a byword for bad behaviour. Let me end with this. I hope all members know I care passionately about Parliament. The vast majority of members are here to do good. We make significant sacrifices, as our partners know. We make a big difference, often on campaigns that have no party issue in them. Indeed, I hope the House will support my acquired brain injury bill on the 3rd of December. I think that was unanimous, Mr. Speaker. But if the public believe that we are marking our own homework, our reputation individually and collectively will be tarnished. Independence is essential to protect us. A Conservative MP said to me yesterday, "There have been times when I have been ashamed of being a member of this House. I don't want to go back to that." Of course, I, as chairman of the committee, remain a servant of the House. But I also have to look at the public. They want the House to uphold the highest possible standards. Nobody can be above the rules. It is the public who should judge this, and I fear they will find us all wanting if the amendment is carried today. I warn colleagues with all my heart, don't do something today that we will rue in the future.
Reform can only work if it's across the House, and by bringing her amendment today, it looks like we're moving the goalpost.
But the government maintain they're not showing Owen Paterson's special favours. The issues raised by his case reflect more widespread concern amongst MPs about whether the current anti-sleaze system gives them a fair hearing.
I think the reason it has come now is because of the volume of complaints that have come through and the more widespread feeling of unfairness across all benches that have been brought to my attention and the attention of others. In very simplistic, cliched terms, this is the famous straw that has broken the long-suffering camel's back.
Public trust in politicians remains low, and critics say that to be seen to be writing their own rule book won't do anything to restore it. But the government would argue that changes are long overdue. Well, Sophie, tonight the cross-party consent on the way that complaints against MPs are handled appears to be lying in tatters, because in the last half hour, Labour have confirmed, along with the SNP, that they will not take part in any discussions with the Conservatives about changing parliamentary rules. In fact, they're actually relishing the prospect of portraying the government as soft on sleaze. But I reckon Boris Johnson's calculation is this, that in the wider world away from Westminster, people are far more worried about their own jobs and prospects than those of members of Parliament.
Ian Watson, thank you.
To cries of shame echoing around the Commons, MPs have voted to put former Conservative Minister Owen Paterson's suspension on hold, instead opting to tear up Parliament's own disciplinary system. It follows an investigation which found Mr Paterson had committed an egregious breach of lobbying rules, an investigation which he said did not comply with natural justice. The Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, vowed to boycott the new committee set up to overhaul the sleaze regulations. There is no other word for it, he said. Corruption. Our correspondent Paul McNamara reports.
The ayes to the right, 250. The noes to the
These
left,
benches are no stranger to discontent. But the shouts of shame are rare.
What have you done to this place?
The vote whether to back a review of standards investigations. And because of it, the man on the left, Conservative MP Owen Paterson, avoided the consequences of his own investigation. An investigation that found he misused his position to benefit two companies he worked for.
In no other profession in our country could someone be found guilty by an independent process and just have their mates vote them back into the job. Surely the Prime Minister and his government are not going to do that today.
This wasn't about friends but fairness, said the Prime Minister.
The issue in this case is whether a member of this House had a fair opportunity to make representations in this case, or whether as a matter of natural justice, our procedures in this House allow for proper appeal.
An investigation by Parliament Standards Commissioner Catherine Stone described the MP's actions as an egregious case of paid advocacy, saying no previous case of paid advocacy had seen so many breaches or such a clear pattern of behaviour in failing to separate private and public interest. He repeatedly asked for meetings with ministers and the Food Standards Agency, in one email praising Randox for their superior technology. What he didn't always declare, though, that he was being paid by them, £100,000 per year as a consultant. A parliamentary committee, including 3 Tory MPs, agreed with the report and recommended a 30-day suspension. But Mr Patterson, who has always insisted his innocence, said the process gave him no way to appeal or present 17 witnesses. The main vote today was meant to be about whether or not to suspend Owen Paterson. Instead, it's about whether or not to change the system entirely. The proposal, a new select committee with a majority of Conservative MPs, chaired by a Conservative MP, that will decide whether or not to change the system for investigating MPs. Despite the timing of all this, the Prime Minister's spokesperson said, this isn't about Owen Paterson, it's about long-standing issues. She said, quote, it is absolutely not a case of MPs marking their own homework.
If the public believe that we are marking our own homework, our reputation individually and collectively will be tarnished.
And does he not realise this just looks to everyone as if he simply doesn't like the conclusion that the old committee has come to?
And listening on to today's debate in stony silence, the very man at the centre of it. How do you think this looks to lots of people outside of Parliament who think it's one rule for you, another rule for them?
I'm sure that's how it will be presented, but that isn't the case. Today we did not decide on Mr Patterson. We decided to look into having a new system, and then Mr Patterson and anyone else who's before the Standards Committee will be looked at by that process, which may mean that Mr Patterson is acquitted, that's one way, but you may finish up with an increased sentence for the same one.
People will read tomorrow's headlines, which no doubt will be lurid, and we shall take a lot of stick for it. But the bottom line is we have to get this right. The system is broken, we have to mend it.
The timing's not great though, is it?
Oh, gosh, no, it's awful.
Owen Paterson said he's experienced 2 years of hell and is grateful to MPs for ensuring fundamental changes. Tonight he was asked if he was worried how this would look, that rules have been changed retrospectively.
Well, if it's portrayed as that, that's the parody, that will look bad. But that is not actually what's happened. What's happened is we have a chance to build a new system where evidence is exchanged, where witnesses are properly interrogated.
The argument was this vote would ensure the system is fairer. The result, say many MPs, is that to the public this will look anything but. Look, many MPs were saying to us today, the timing isn't great, but we want a fairer system. The way they've gone about this, though, may have backfired on them. As of tonight, the current Standards Commissioner says she's not going anywhere. Labour and the SNP say this new committee, they won't take part in it. So at the moment, it's not looking entirely clear how this moves forward. We've spoken to Tory MPs today. They've been telling us that their inboxes have been filling up with angry people getting in touch with them, saying it's one rule for you, another rule for everyone else. People they don't normally get emails from. I spoke to another Conservative MP I bumped in earlier on. I said, how do you think this is going to play out? Their response was, let's see what happens after we get a kicking in tomorrow's papers.
Paul, thanks very much. Well, a short time ago, I spoke to Dame Andrea Leadsom, the former Commons leader who tabled that amendment to change the way allegations of MPs' misconduct are investigated. I asked her first if MPs had effectively let Mr Patterson off the hook.
No, that is not the case at all. I've made extremely clear, explicitly in the amendment, that what the House does is simply defer consideration of this report for 3 months, whilst a select committee, which is politically balanced, will review not the rules, so this is in no way letting anybody off the hook for any wrongdoing, but it will simply review whether the process was fair.
I just wonder, though, whether you personally agree on the facts as you see them, that there has been an egregious breach of the rules here, or whether you feel a sort of deep sense of sympathy for a bereaved man.
I'm not forming a judgment on the facts of the case. It's perfectly possible that there has been a breach of rules, and I certainly don't condone any breach of rules. What I'm concerned about is that the process should be transparently fair. You know, we as MPs spend most of our lives fighting for justice for our constituents, and I find it really disappointing that there is such an outcry when I try to put forward the thesis that MPs should also be subjected to the same level of justice and fairness and transparency in the investigations into their behaviour.
Labour says you're wallowing in sleaze. The Labour leader says it's corrupt. Do you not feel even a tiny bit grubby doing this?
I really don't, honestly. I mean, I completely understand that what the opposition parties have chosen to do today is to be partisan about this. And obviously, because it's a Conservative Member of Parliament, they have chosen to misunderstand and misinterpret what the amendment today seeks to do. But I say again, I am not making any judgment on the individual case. What I'm saying is that we need to make sure that the system that oversees MPs is fair as we fight day in, day out for justice for people who are not members of Parliament. This is not right.
That might stack up if you'd intervened on behalf of a Labour MP, but you've made it partisan,
Which I
haven't you, by
would have
intervening?
done. Cathy,
Well, you
I would
didn't,
have
though,
done.
did you?
When are you thinking of?
Well, I'm sure we could pick any number, but I mean, you know, Tory,
choose
you
one.
intervene now
Choose one.
on behalf of your
Choose one.
Conservative colleagues. Well, let me. Some of your colleagues are absolutely horrified about what's going on. Colleagues on your side of the House. Let me just read to you messages that one Tory MP got in their inbox. Several different messages. Number one, changing the rules to protect one of your own is not how a grown-up democracy works. Number two, the Prime Minister obviously feels that he can ride roughshod over the decision of an independent inquiry at no cost to you, the party, or himself. Well, he can't. If you support the amendment to be voted on this afternoon, then I regret that for the foreseeable future, I will not be voting for the Conservatives. Are you not worried about the backlash?
Allow me to refute those allegations. There is absolutely no intention to let anyone off or to change the rules. It is absolutely against the rules to undertake paid advocacy. And if it is the case that this individual has undertaken paid advocacy, then that individual will face the full sanctions. What the amendment today is looking at, plain and simply, is whether that individual had a fair investigation or not, and whether that investigation followed the laws of natural justice. And just to answer your earlier point, Cathy, I absolutely would have put forward an amendment had he been a Labour MP. And Jess Phillips raised that in the chamber. She was accusing us of, well, it's just because it's Conservative. I'm sorry, I literally refute that to my dying day. This is about justice for MPs being as important as justice for our constituents, and I will always fight for the latter, and it's right to fight for the former.
Members of the public may not read the amendment carefully, and what's coming across to them is the perception that it's back to the bad old days of Tory sleaze. This isn't in the media, this is someone messaging one of your colleagues, and that colleague was concerned enough to raise it with us.
Where are they getting their views from? Where are they getting their views from? I was totally clear. Anybody who wants to see my remarks in the chamber, this is not letting anyone off. It's not changing the rules. It's not about sleaze. It's not about supporting somebody so that they can break the rules. Not at all. What this is about a fair and transparent system of justice for MPs as much as it is about for our constituents.
Do you fear you might pay an electoral price for this?
I mean, you know, so be it. You know, the point is, you know, justice, you can't threaten me. You can't throw people's opinions at me and start accusing me of all manner of things, making it true by virtue of your accusation. I am standing up for justice and transparency, and I'm proud to be doing that.
Dame Andrea Leadsom, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Well, joining me now is the Shadow Leader of the House, Fangham Debonair. Well, you heard Andrea Leadsom there saying she's not letting anyone off the hook. She'd have intervened on behalf of a Labour MP wrongly accused to overhaul the system. She's done you a favour.
Well, this is quite extraordinary, Cathy. What happened was we have a process, and the Tory MPs that voted for this amendment today, for Andrea Leadsom's amendment today, voted to tear that process up. It's a transparent and fair process. The Independent Parliamentary Standards Commissioner had investigated Mr Patterson, found him to have committed wrongdoing. The Parliamentary Standards Committee then checked the evidence, did take evidence from Mr Patterson himself, including the character witnesses, and found an egregious breach of the lobbying rules. Well, that's not OK.
Well, Owen Patterson said that the current system doesn't respect natural justice. It was shockingly inadequate, and he claims the Commissioner didn't speak to 17 witnesses who came forward to support him. That's not fair, is it?
Well, courts don't speak to everyone who puts their hand up and said, I want to be a witness in a court case. There were some absurd parallels drawn today in the House of Commons. I'm afraid to say that witnesses provided character witness statements. They were properly considered. They're in the Standards report. I've read them. They were considered. And the Standards Committee, who are a carefully drawn committee with balance, with MPs from all parties and lay members, found that Mr Patterson had committed an egregious breach of the rules. That's not OK.
But if you had a ruling that you didn't support against you, you'd want the right to appeal, wouldn't you?
Well, he's had the right to appeal and he used it. The Commissioner found that he had committed improper acts and he'd committed lobbying that he shouldn't have done. And the Standards Committee then invited him to give evidence on his behalf, which he took up. He provided evidence, he had legal counsel, he provided character witnesses, and character witnesses' evidence was taken into account.
But this is all a complete mess now, isn't it? You say you'll boycott this new committee the Conservatives want to set up, which they say will be much better. It's in the mess, isn't it? What do you do?
Well, it's an extraordinary thing to have done, to have tried to set up a committee without thinking about how they're going to resource it, how they're going to pay for it. No, we're not having anything to do with this sham Tory committee, because I'm afraid to say we've already got one. We don't need another one. We've got a good Standards Committee that is already quite properly reviewing the whole process, as they are right to do every single Parliament. This is not OK. It's Tory. I'm afraid to say it's Tory MPs voting to protect Tory mates.
Briefly, your leader has written a stinging article saying that this is corruption. If you think you can capitalise on this, you'll surely be mistaken, as you were about all the other sleaze scandals that you tried to whip up a fuss about.
Well, this is about honourable behaviour. The public has a right to expect that MPs will not do paid advocacy. Mr Patterson was found to have committed paid advocacy, and the government, instead of following the process, just decided to rip the whole thing up. Well, the message that gives people, and it gives that to MPs and to members of the public, it gives to Tory MPs in particular, that if a Tory MP breaks the rules and is found to have broken the rules, the government will just rip up the rules. That is not OK. Andrea Leadsom saying that she's not changing the rules. She is exactly doing that. She's trying to change the process by which everything is assessed. Those are guided by rules, and that's what she's done today.
Thangam Debonair, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Owen Patterson, found guilty by the independent watchdog, will not face suspension now. This evening, he thanked his colleagues for their vote.
They will have taken a political hit, but we will at last now be able to create a proper system based on the rules of natural justice.
Conservatives say the investigation procedure was unfair. Opposition parties ask what the government is trying to hide. Also tonight, we're in the English Channel working out who has the rights to fish where. And Joe Biden was elected president a year ago today, but are the Democrats suffering the midterm blues a year early? Hello, good evening. The MP at the centre of the lobbying scandal says he wanted only to clear his name. As of tonight, his name may be synonymous with a rule change that provoked accusations the governing party was making itself morally bankrupt. Owen Patterson was found guilty over lobbying that earned him hundreds of thousands of pounds. But tonight his Conservative colleagues rallied round him, voting down his suspension and saying the system itself had not played fair. Labour cannot believe what it's seeing and says the move, coming after the guilty verdict, speaks to sleaze, corruption and privilege. And tonight a former Attorney General told Newsnight it would not escape notice that the PM himself was the subject of investigation by that same Commissioner. Tonight, as the old system's being scrapped, Labour said they'll boycott any new committee to replace the watchdog. Here's Lewis Goodall.
The ayes to the right, 250. The noes to the left, 232.
Order. What have you done to this place?
Shame. Today, for the first time, MPs in effect rejected the recommendations of the Committee on Standards about the misconduct of one of their own. The government whipped their benches to put on hold the recommended 30-day suspension of Owen Patterson, a former cabinet minister, for breaking multiple Commons rules on lobbying. Instead, the government proposed to establish a new committee to change the rules and the system itself.
Any disciplinary process, concerned as it is with people's jobs and livelihoods, must be fair and respect basic principles of natural justice.
It divided the House along party lines.
We would be dismantling the rule on paid advocacy, which has been around in some shape or form since 1695. I'm afraid the public would think that we would be the Parliament that licensed cash for questions.
Over his conduct, the report into Mr Patterson's lobbying by the Standards Committee was damning. It concerned his paid employment by two firms, Randox Chemicals and LYNN'S Country Foods, over several years. The committee found that Mr Patterson, quote, repeatedly used his position as a member to promote the companies by whom he was paid, and therefore breached paragraph 11 of the 2015 MP's Code of Conduct. This included use of his parliamentary office, parliamentary note paper, and repeatedly lobbying ministers on behalf of these companies. Mr Patterson said his conduct had fallen under a parliamentary exemption, a contention with which the committee disagreed. And though the firms didn't extract immediate financial gain, the committee noted no previous case of paid advocacy has seen so many breaches or such a clear pattern of behaviour in failing to separate private and public interests. And they also noted that Mr Patterson's financial remuneration from Randox and LYNN'S amounted to nearly 3 times his annual parliamentary salary.
It would be much better if we'd been able to change the rules separately from it.
Mr Patterson and his allies said that the process had not been fair.
As a barrister, you will know, of course, that anybody has to be tried, not under retrospective changes, but under the rules and laws as they exist at the time. And what you've done today as MPs is go and say, actually, we don't like those rules, we're going to apply some new ones. That wouldn't stand up in a court of law, would it?
What is important, I think, is that we do have a fair system. And when people think about the reality of what we've got, if any individual, one of our constituents was in a disciplinary proceeding in their profession or in their workplace, they would be entitled to have witnesses called if they wish them actually to give oral evidence. They would be entitled to have their own choice of representative, and they would have an independent appeal. And unfortunately, those aspects are lacking in the system we've got at the moment.
Observers are less generous.
What they're suggesting is that a new committee will be set up to report back within the next few months about how this system works and what improvements could be made. The debate we saw in the Commons this afternoon had a lot of criticism because they want that to have a majority of Conservative MPs, and therefore there's a sense on the opposition backbenches that the government is trying to use that to engineer a system that will end up exonerating Owen Paterson.
It was also, of course, the system which had been in place for years, and older hands deeply worry about what all of this will mean for Parliament.
Order!
Order.
It has set Parliament back, in my eyes, way before even the expenses scandal. We're back to the early 90s. You know, in the early 90s, the Committee of Standards in Public Life recommended that we accept an independent parliamentary commissioner that did investigations in relation to MPs. We got lay members onto the committee, so it was give more a hope to the British public. This is not MPs looking after the interests of MPs. I'm sad to say that we've gone back to those days today, and I deeply regret seeing it.
The Commissioner told us tonight that she will be staying in post until her term expires in December 2022. But after today, what is left for her to enforce? After all, the SNP and the Labour Party have made clear that they will be boycotting the government's new committee. The old system is effectively in abeyance until such time as that committee makes its recommendations, which it cannot credibly do without opposition support. The net result is paralysis, stasis, that the parliamentary regime for standards is effectively on hold. Critics argue that this is part of a pattern, a government which has often failed to apply the rules to itself. The danger, they say, is that once you've started down that road, you never stop.
That was Lewis Goodall, and Nick Watt is joining us now. What is the sense, Nick? Just take us through the sense in Parliament that you've been feeling tonight.
Well, I have to say that ministers that I've been talking to are looking pretty glum tonight. One told me this all looks awful and this is going to hang around our necks like an albatross for some time. Now, this was a show of force by Number 10 and it did face pushback from quite a lot of its MPs. So it ordered them to vote for this backbench amendment. 13 said no and rebelled. Around about 100 Conservative MPs didn't vote for this. 35 of those are sort of registered as abstentions, and that includes Angela Richardson, the Conservative MP for Guildford, who now fully expects to be sacked as a ministerial aide. Now, every MP, every Conservative MP I spoke to who voted with the government told me that they believe that Owen Paterson did break the rules. That minister I spoke to said that Owen Paterson had made mistakes, and this minister fully expects at the end of this process Owen Paterson will face a sanction, though this minister thinks it won't be a career-ending one, because the point about this proposed suspension is that would lead to a recall petition that could then obviously lead to a by-election. But this minister said that Owen Paterson had genuine motivations for this lobbying. It was about concerns in the food processing chains, though obviously that would have benefited these companies that he was supporting because obviously they had the new technology. Now, every MP I voted for again who voted with the government said this vote today was not about letting Owen Paterson off the hook. It's about setting up what they regard as a fairer system. It should not be inquisitorial, it should be adversarial, and you should be able to challenge it.
But where are we, Nick, with that fairer system? Because as Lewis was explaining, if Labour's going to boycott the new one and the Conservatives don't like the old one, the whole thing's on hold.
Yes, well, the government does have a big problem tonight, because effectively what happened was that Parliament, as you say, voted for a new committee, a new standards committee that's meant to have cross-party membership. It specifies how many Labour and SNP MPs should be on it, and they have said no, which gives it a real credibility problem. And senior Conservative MPs are really angry that the Chief Whip allowed this to happen, didn't clear it with Labour, and I think there are going to be some pretty awkward conversations tomorrow.
Nick, thanks very much indeed. Well, joining us now, Peter Bottomley, the Conservative MP for Worthing West, who voted against the Andrea Leadsom amendment but abstained on that suspension of Owen Paterson. Labour's shadow leader of the House of Commons, Thengham Devonair, and from the Lords, Peter Lilly, who advocates for a change of the system. And Peter, if you don't mind, Peter Lilly, I'm going to start with you, because there are many in public life to know, as you've been hearing, who believe that what the government did today was unjustifiable, that it was rigging the system to suit the interests of a friend and colleague.
Well, that's probably because they don't know about the system. The system is absolutely indefensible. The investigator is also the prosecutor, can interpret the rules, is the judge. I had a run-in with her when a Labour member said I hadn't declared an interest in the debate where that interest was a conflict of interest. I declared it in my register of interests. She wrote to me and said, "What have you got to say?" I said, "Well, the debate was about domestic energy policy. My interest was about a company which sold gas in Kazakhstan. I didn't think it was relevant." She said, "Oh, all right. Well, you didn't have a conflict of interest, but you should have declared it nonetheless in case people think you did. You must therefore apologise. If you don't, I will publish a report saying that you're guilty." I said, well, if I had a marginal seat and wasn't well known in my seat, that would be the end of my career.
But you're...
Now, wait, hang on. People don't realise that they have such power. She even insisted on writing my defence
Peter, what I'd like to
for me, not
remind
me
people
writing my
is
own.
that happened, your run-in happened 5 years ago, and the system's been in place since 2010. So at any point in the last 5 years, when you were aggrieved by this system, at any point when your colleagues thought the system wasn't working, they could have changed it. But they didn't, and we have seen any number of people pass through this, including many Labour MPs or peers, Jack Straw, Jeff Hoon, Kate Osmore, Stephen Pound. A lot of Labour names have been through that same system. Why didn't the call to change come before now?
Well, I think there has been a call from change from anyone who's experienced it, but so far it hasn't come to the extreme position where it's threatened someone's career. In my case, I was exonerated, so it didn't. But even then, the committee in the House felt they couldn't reject the main recommendation of the Commissioner, even when it's manifestly absurd. So something ought to have been done, but it required an event like this to precipitate a change.
So
better if it had been done sooner, but better not to do it after the event.
It comes down to fairness, and maybe you could say it takes a man at breaking point to get this change made now, finally.
Well, that is quite extraordinary. I mean, I shadow Jacob Rees-Mogg, the leader of the House. Every Thursday morning, we go up against each other across the dispatch boxes. He announces the business of the House for the following week or 2 or 3. He could have put down time for us to debate a changed system. He could have allocated some time. He could have discussed with the business managers and the senior government whips whether it was appropriate to institute some sort of other review. There were people who sponsored the motion, Andrea Leadsom's motion, who are also chairs of select committees that also could have had a role. rule. There were 3 Tory MPs on the Standards Committee that voted, I gather, unanimously, with the exception of Bernard Jenkins, who recused himself, to support the Standards Commissioner. Now, they reviewed the evidence. It is extraordinary that, given the fact that it's up to the government to decide where they put government time, they haven't decided until now, and it's right in the middle of a live case, which I'm afraid has the look of Tory sleaze, because it looks like Tory MPs standing up for a Tory MP, and when they don't like the outcome of a process, they just rip up the process. That's what it looks like.
Peter Bottomley, what were your scruples? Because you were conflicted slightly on the way you voted.
Well, can I just make one preliminary remark, which nobody believes Owen Paterson did what he did for the money. The fact is, he was being paid for a consultancy. He did things which were in the interests of the businesses he's working with, even though he could say for the first initiative it was in the public interest. What I think is the big problem, and my problem, is that I was one of the 38 Tory MPs who abstained on the first vote out of compassion for him. I actually voted against the government on the amended motion because I thought that the decision was wrong. But to begin with, we tried to say that the Commissioner was right and the Standards Committee were right, but perhaps the punishment should have been 9 days rather than over 10 days, which allows for the recall. And I've said in public that were there to be a recall, I would advise his constituents not to vote to have a new by-election. His big mistake since the vote has been, apparently according to the Daily Telegraph, to call for the resignation of the Standards Commissioner and of the Standards Committee. I regard that as disrespectful to a process which we've used for many years, and I agree with those who say if you want to change the process, do it in peacetime, not with a live case in front of us.
I mean, that's what it comes back to, Peter Lilly, that you can't start changing the rules in the middle of a game after a guilty verdict.
Well, it would undoubtedly have been better if it had been done immediately after my case, when everybody who looked at it, which wasn't very many...
Or any of the times that Thangham...
Many times. But it wasn't. It does require, to jolt the House of Commons to change the rules, something like this. Better if it had been done before, but should a man be forced to be tried by an unfair system because we didn't bother to change that unfair system before he came up against it? That's a difficult choice.
Peter Bottomley, I can see you're trying to get in too.
I am. The first time the MP raised the issue, whether it was the nitrites or contamination of milk or the testing in overseas countries, was fine. It's quite clear to do it a second time or a third time or the fourth or fifth or sixth, you either ought to give up the consultancy or you ought to say to the company, the only thing I cannot do if I'm a consultant is talk about things which are of interest to you, to public agencies or to ministers. That was a mistake by my colleague. I hope he recognises that, and it'd be better if he did.
At the moment, there is no body that can act as a watchdog for MPs and their wrongdoing. Thangham,
there is. The Standards Commissioner is the watchdog. The Standards Commissioner operates a system that Parliament voted for. The Standards Commissioner then makes recommendations, having done the investigations, proposes them, but the Standards Committee, which contains MPs on both sides and lay members with expertise, they have to thoroughly investigate to see whether or not they feel that that is a fair recommendation. They also took evidence from Mr. Owen Paterson.
System on that one.
Well, that is an appeal system. I mean, when you have an investigation by the Standards Commissioner, it then goes to the Parliamentary Standards Commission. They go through all of the evidence. They took evidence from Mr. Paterson himself. They read character witnesses. They looked at everything. I've read this report. Yeah. It's very, very thorough. That is in effect an appeal system.
What are you going to do then if Labour carry on recognising the one that has been put in place and stays in place for the last 11 years? And the Conservatives have set up this new body with no other party on it. It's a one-party judge and jury.
They refuse to take part in it. I haven't thought through that, I must admit. But we should remember that the present system was set up in the middle of a case, the expenses case. So you didn't object to setting up a new system then.
It's been reviewed since then. It's been changed since then. I mean, yes. Well, the expenses scandal happened in 2009, and the Standards Committee, in its current format, was after that. So I mean, yes, crises do then lead to change. Yeah. But the Committee on Standards actually does review the process. It's reviewing it at the moment. In fact, when we add on to that, though, the Committee on Standards in Public Life, which reported this Monday, said that the thing that needed to happen to the system system was for it to change, yes, but to be
Because
strengthened.
Some Labour MPs think that as well. You've had 28 MPs that didn't vote. I know some were paired, but there will be questions within your own party about how the
My
system's
understanding is that all of them were paired, because there are some at COP and there are at COP26 and there are some on select committee visits.
Peter's shaking his head. You don't think that's right?
I couldn't swear to it, obviously.
I think that may be right, but that's for the statisticians. The key point is it's not the first time it happened. It happened 18 years ago when I withdrew as a matter of practical disgust with what happened when Elizabeth Filkin, the previous Standards Commissioner, was knifed by a combination of the then government, which happened to be Labour, the then Speaker, who I thought behaved inadvisedly. And this is not new. The key point is that the government's now in a situation which is not quite under control. I hope they'll listen to what Chris Bryant said at the end of the debate today. If they want to consult me privately, I'll give them private advice, which will be more forthright than I can say in public. And I hope that Owen Paterson will understand why people believe that what he did repeatedly was improper.
There are
Until Parliament can decide what's proper, we're in a mess.
There are some that think that this is, if you like, a future-proofing that goes to higher up the food chain. And one of those is the former Attorney General Dominic Grieve, who said to us this evening, it cannot escape notice that the Prime Minister is currently the subject of investigation for failure to declare his interests by that same commissioner. Was this Boris Johnson getting in early because he can see where this trail is going?
No.
No. You have a more objective view there from Peter. I don't know what goes inside Boris's head, but I have no reason to suppose it was. I think the main concerns were around Owen Paterson, whether he had a fair trial.
It looks tonight for the public to gaze in on this and say one majority party has swept aside a system.
No. The new system will be applied to Owen Paterson. He may well be found guilty by it, and he may well be punished by it. But it will be a fairer system and one more in accord with natural justice.
The system, the government actually said a few weeks ago that they couldn't possibly change rules retrospectively in relation to a different case, and that's exactly what they've done today.
All right, we'll end it there. Thank you all very much indeed. Thanks for coming in.